disappointed.
The bar is
Hey,
low.
Steve, I'm Logan. I'm going to handle all the video stuff today.
Okay.
Sarah's going to be doing the audio.
Oh, okay.
And we'll get you set up with a microphone.
Right on. Sorry, you guys. I just finished 2 other classes, so.
You have slides.
I don't have slides. I don't even have underwear on. So.
You want to run the sound? Sure. Or slides.
I know.
It's okay. It's okay.
I would have taken that seat in the back row if I known that.
Oh, so is it happening online too?
On YouTube.
Oh, okay. Okay. Do you want me to stand anywhere in particular?
Camera will follow you.
Oh, that's creepy. Okay. Almost gonna track you.
To be clear, me. Sarah, do you have a handout for Helen?
So Helen said you were doing your Zoom class from Harvard.
I was, yeah. I'm done now. I'm ready to start. I don't know, this music is very interesting, but yeah.
We're ready for it.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Hokinson. I am a program coordinator for Johnson County Library and just here to welcome you to the conference. As we come together today, we acknowledge that this land has long been home to Indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations. We recognize and honor the Kansa, Kaskaskia, Kickapoo, Osage, Peoria, Sioux, and Shawnee tribes and acknowledge their continued presence, resilience, and cultural contributions. May we engage with this space, this place, with awareness, respect, and a commitment to learning from the past as we create together in the present. All right, in addition to our conference book, Truth is the Arrow, Mercy is the Bow, a DIY manifesto. No, I'm on the wrong line. Can we start over? We can't. I'll just keep going. Okay, all the books, but I do want to say against football. Because we're in Chiefstown. For 4 years, Steve hosted the New York Times Dear Sugars podcast with his pal Cheryl Strayed. He is the recipient of a 2022 NEA grant in fiction, and his short stories have been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize, Best American Erotica, and Best American Mysteries series. He also publishes crazy DIY books. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thanks. I mostly want to answer questions. I assume if you're in this room, it's because you've suffered some species of writer's block, or yes, right? Can we just have a little, how many people have gotten writer's block? Okay, how many people have not gotten writer's block? Because you need to leave if you haven't. All right, good. So we're all safe. It's a safe space. I'll tell you a couple of stories about that have sort of formed how I think of writer's block, and then I really just want to take questions. And I do mean questions. Sometimes people will say, I have more of a statement. And I'm like, okay. But I'd rather it's a question, partly because I think it has to do with what I was talking about last night, that I think it's the writer's job to not know things and be curious about them and be in some state of confusion that's actually the thing that you share with the reader. So what I'll say is that I, for many years, I guess, thought about writer's block as like, it's sort of like the bubonic plague of writerdom. It's like this terrible thing that you get, and once you get it, it may be infectious, and you have to kind of quarantine yourself, and there's some sense of being mildly ashamed of the whole thing, or more than mildly. And over the years, my thinking about it has just really shifted a lot. And part of the reason is because I've gone through long periods of not being able to write. And I think people tend to hide that part of the creative life or romanticize it. And neither one really captures what's happening, which is that you're just debilitated by doubt. You know, and I think that there are really two feeling states that drive writing. Yeah, if you could turn off your phone, nobody will think you're an asshole. That's okay. In fact, you might have to have your phone on because there's some emergency in your life. That's fine. Don't sweat that. But if you can turn your phone off, please do. It'll automatically make you more sexy. So there are these two states that kind of obtain when you're writing. And the first state is a state of kind of irrational self-belief. You have this like urgent sense that you have something to say to the world, a story that needs to be told, and you're really just absolutely curious, riven by curiosity, and that you have a certain self-belief that it's a story that other people are going to hear, and they need to hear it, and it's kind of pouring out of you like scripture, and it's great. I think that's a great place to be in. Now, inevitably, you're going to look back at some of the decisions that you made under the influence of that intoxicating feeling, and you're going to go, ugh, which actually is good. That means your critical faculty is kind of calling bullshit on some of the indulgences that we can get into when we really are feeling ourselves. But I like that state. I think that state's necessary of self-belief, of like, I'm going to do it. I can do it. I have something to say. It's worth hearing, and it's coming out. Then there's this other state that people fall into, which is just the opposite. It's a sense that it's not going to end well. And whatever you're up to, it's not original, and somebody said it before, and somebody said it better, and somebody said it with more standing. And maybe really a sense of lost hope or doom about the possibility that any of these decisions that you're making, these word decisions that you're making, have any worth at all. And that maybe the best outcome is that, like, eventually your mom comes and delivers you soup and asks why you're depressed. And that's writer's block, basically. And those two states are going to be with you always. How they fluctuate is sort of particular to the writer, but those two feeling states are just the price of doing business as a creative person. If you're going to create and make creative decisions, I think you need to accept that you're going to sometimes feel bulletproof and absolutely certain of what you're doing, and other times you're going to feel absolutely bereft and pointless and down on yourself and all those evil voices. I had my first big bout of writer's block in the wake of a huge creative failure, I guess I'll say. And I don't look at it as failure now, but I certainly did then. I just published my first book of short stories after, I'd been convinced that I would, publish a book at 30. And then I thought, well, maybe 33, that's the Christ year, that's a good year, 33, maybe 33. And it wasn't until my late 30s that I published a collection of stories. And I think, like a lot of people, I thought, well, when that first book gets published, it's like it's going to cure all the doubt that I walk around with. And people are going to, like, all the old girlfriends will come back and say, we were wrong, and whatever. I'll walk down the sidewalk and people will throw money at me. And it was not actually what happened, it turns out. I sold a few books, and my parents, I think, bought the book and carried it in a brown paper bag. They were like, wow, there's a lot of adult material in this book. Anyway, and then I, under the influence of the market and my agent's advice, I was told, now you need to write a novel. And actually that voice was inside me already. I had a whole bunch of hang-ups about writing a novel. And I do think that a novel is like an amazing form of storytelling. And it's this deeper, larger canvas. And there's a lot to recommend it. I love novels. And I was very eager to write one. But I think I was full of ego need. I have to write a novel or I won't be ... And I don't think that wasn't so healthy. So I did set about writing a novel. It's actually the third novel that I'd attempted, but the first one after I was a published author. And I spent about 2.5, 3 years writing about a guy named Shabbatai Tzvi. Does anybody know who Shabbatai Tzvi is? Well, that's Old Testament. He's like the most famous false messiah in Jewish history. He was around in the 17th century, and he led an incredible life. About half the world's Jews thought that he was the Messiah. And they sold all their possessions, and they took ships to Jerusalem, and they thought he was going to confront the Sultan, and that the days of Jubilee would arrive, that he was the Messiah. And he did actually confront the Sultan, and the Sultan said, well, that's an interesting theory that you're the Messiah, but actually here's the deal I'm going to make you, Shabbatai Tzvi. you can be the Messiah and I'll chop your head off, or you can convert to Islam. And he said, you know, Islam has always intrigued me, at any rate. And he converted. And I thought this guy's life he was probably almost certainly bipolar. He had periods of illumination in which he would have frantic energy and lead these antinomian, all these sort of kind of big, grandiose, manic proclamations about breaking all kinds of rules and men and women dancing together and all these things that were very much against the culture that he was a part of. And other periods where he's described as being cloaked in darkness and he doesn't speak at all for many months. And I thought, this sounds familiar as somebody who has a bipolar sibling. I recognize this. But regardless of that, his life was really big and tumultuous. And I thought, well, that's a great novel. I kind of suck at plot, and that's a big plot. And so I set about writing this novel. It took me about 3 years. And unfortunately, one of the things I discovered is that you have to know a character from the inside. You really have to love them and know them from the inside and understand what their internal conflicts are. And that's really what drives the story forward. And I did not get to that level with Svi. I understood him from the outside to be an interesting historical figure, but I never got to really figure him out from the inside. It's a way of saying that and maybe you know this feeling, I kind of pushed him around the Levant for 2.5 years, hoping he would bump into the big ticket items, love and loss and self-revelation. And instead, we all got exhausted. And then I sent this 850-page novel off to my agent at the time, and she too got exhausted, not surprisingly. And though it had taken me about, I think almost 3 years to write this book, it took her only about 40 seconds to deliver the bad news. And she was right, which made it even worse. God damn her, God, and I was so angry, and then that boiled away, and I just fell right through the floor. And I went into a, pretty like level 7 depression. Not 10, but I was bummed. And in this period of depression, it's that second feeling that I've talked about of feeling that it's pointless to get to the keyboard. It's pointless. There's no need for it. It won't end well. Nobody wants any more of my pornographic stories, and I can't write a novel, and I don't know what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to sit around in bed. And the only thing in those days that was getting me out of bed, in fact, was chocolate. A good quality chocolate would get me out of bed. And yet, because I was gainfully unemployed, I did not have a lot of money. And so I started going to this place, the Haviland Chocolate Factory in Cambridge, a few miles from my apartment, sold what are called seconds, basically defective chocolate, which to me is an oxymoron. I don't think there is defective, but the stuff that like it gets stuck together or the enrobing is too thick. Oh, the horror of horrors. And so they can't put it on the shelves, And so I could go to that shop and get like a 3-pound box of Thin Mints where the dark chocolate was too thick and so they couldn't sell them on the shelves, and I could buy that for like $3. It was heavenly and deeply moving. My triglycerides were tested at this time, unfortunately. That's where they... And the normal range is from 0 to 150, and my triglycerides were at 333. Yeah, it was a proud moment for everybody. Any rate, so I'm eating all this candy, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, this is really the only thing that I'm interested in at this point. And at a certain point, even buying this very cheap, second defective chocolate, I was running out of money, and I thought, well, I've got to do something to start earning. And I'd been in journalism for several years, and so I thought, I would always think, well, this candy is coming from somewhere, and it turns out it was coming from the chocolate factory that was on the second, third, and fourth floor of this building where the candy shop was. And so I wrote some bullshit letter to the weekly paper in Boston, saying, I'd like to write about this chocolate factory and the history of candy in Boston, whatever else. I did a little bit of research, and they said, sure, go ahead, give it a whirl. And this fascinating thing happened. I got into the chocolate factory. In fact, I got into the elevator, and the elevator, when it opened up, it smelled like, in Halloween where you like put your face into the pillowcase and go and breathe in that bouquet. That's what the elevators smelled like. And then you get into the factory floor, and they make something called Necco wafers, which are these weird, some of you might know, they're like the candy communion wafers, these little pastel-colored wafers. And I got into that floor of the candy factory, and it was like the floor was covered. It was like a huge, like the size of this library, the floor was covered in shards of Necco wafers. It was like the most beautiful pastel Kandinsky painting you've ever seen. It was like, oh my God. And there were these giant cauldrons of caramel, like 50-pound copper cauldrons that were just bubbling with caramel, and these conveyor belts carrying little marshmallow bunnies, and they were being enrobed. That means there's like the curtain of chocolate washing down, and they were being enrobed in dark chocolate, and they would emerge kind of shimmering. And I was like, I'm in fucking heaven. I was in heaven. And the feeling I actually had was just that the depression just disappeared. It just went poof. And my antennae were out. I was so interested in everything that I was seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I didn't think anything about writer's block or anything. I just thought, I want to get back in another goddamn candy factory. Something is happening. Whatever those negative feelings are about hopelessness and doom and all that ego crap was just washed away by curiosity, a kind of ravenous curiosity to be in this space and just soak it up and write about it. And so I just started, this was even before the internet, I think, or before I just started writing letters to all these different companies that make candy bars. And all the big ones were like, no way, because you guys must know that like Willy Wonka is based on the very real paranoia around trade secrets being discovered. Since candy's not that complicated, it's mostly boiled sugar, and there's like 6 ingredients in every candy bar. And so the equity for these companies is really in the production process. And so at the big companies, they're very paranoid about making sure that nobody gets their trade secrets. You know this, right? So like I asked to get into the Mars factory, for instance, in New Jersey, and they were like, no, I'm sorry, there's no way we can do that. And even when they have people come in from outside to like fix something that they can't fix in-house, they'll lead the person and they'll blindfold them in the parking lot, lead them in to the place that's stamping the little M on the M&Ms or whatever it is. They'll have them fix the particular thing, and then they put the blindfold back in and walk them back out to the parking lot and shoot them in the back of the head. That's a true story. So my point is that the big factories wouldn't let me in. In fact, a lot of factories wouldn't, because I just was somebody who was like a minor literary pornographer asking to visit their factories. Cherry Mash, the makers of Cherry Mash, would not let me into their factory. And later they were indignant, saying, why didn't you write about my candy bar? I was like, because you wouldn't let me in. But the Twin Bing Company up in Sioux City, Iowa, did let me in. And so I got to write about the Twin Bing and the Idaho Spud up in Boise, and the Goo Goo Cluster and the Valo Milk, which those of you who are fellow candy freaks, Russ will come and bring us many Valo Milks. And I got to write about, basically, I got to visit all of these factories and write about the world of candy, which really was something that I'd been obsessed with for a long time. My childhood, I mean, I think lots of people are interested in candy because it's sort of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of childhood. It's the first great transgressive pleasure. But also for me and my family, it was the first antidepressant, to be perfectly blunt. It was like a dependable source of happiness in a childhood that was oftentimes, there's a lot of fighting and loneliness and whatever else. So, and in fact, even as I was reporting out this book, it didn't occur to me, I thought the whole thing was a fraud. I thought I was a literary author who was going to write big, important books, but I'd failed, and therefore I was doing this gimmicky, dumb book about candy, and it was all just a sellout and whatever. I had all these negative feelings about it. But it turns out that I'd been paying really careful and passionate attention to a very interesting part of the world, and people's feelings about candy are very deep and primal, and the role that it's played in this country's history is also fascinating. In a way, what's happened is everything that's happened in late model capitalism. The big companies have swallowed up the little companies, and all the stuff that we consume now is sort of homogenized. It used to be that every city, like Kansas City, would have 6 or 7 different confectioners, all of whom made really weird, crazy candies based on what was grown around here. And the same thing with breweries and bakeries. You know, it wasn't always Wonder Bread and McDonald's logos. There was a time where people were more rooted to the things that they consumed were produced in their communities. So I was also writing in part about kind of the history of American commerce and business. And all that stuff I didn't know that I would find, but when you're really interested in something, it turns out it becomes interesting. It tells a larger story. And I remember that I sent this weird book, Candy Freak, out to a bunch of agents, and they all said no. They said, we don't know what this book is, it's weird, and we don't know where it would go in Borders, which was not funny back then. Now it's sort of ironic. And I know what they meant, actually. We don't know where this belongs in the market. It's a weird book. And they're sort of right. It is weird. But I put it in a drawer and thought, well, that was a failed experiment, even though I got a lot of free candy. And it took actually a few friends of mine saying, what happened to that candy thing you were working on? You were flying off to Boise, Idaho to go visit the Idaho Speed. You told all these wild stories. Like, what happened to that book? And I said, oh, well, the agents didn't like it, and so I'm giving up on it. And they said, well, you shouldn't do that. Don't be so easily knocked off your mission. And I said, well, okay, maybe you're right. And I dusted it off, and I sent it off to a few editors at very small publishers. And one of them said yes. The rest of them said no. But that's all it takes is one of them to say yes. And later, a friend of mine, the book came out and unexpectedly was a bestseller for about 4 seconds. But so it sold very well by my standards. And a friend of mine said, she read it and she said, that's so interesting, Steve. It's like you wrote your way out of a depression, she said. And I realized she was right. That's exactly what had happened. Which is to say, I was very blocked. And the way that I got unblocked was by lowering the bar for myself and asking not what should I be writing, but what do I feel will get me back to the keyboard. So my first piece of advice as fellow sufferers in the world of writer's block is if you're experiencing doubt and uncertainty and it's debilitating, it's gotten to the point where it's getting in the way, then lower the expectations on yourself. I know that sounds very anti-American, but lower the bar. I once visited for another book a musician who I admire a lot and who's written like thousands of songs. And I was astonished before his creativity, his fecundity. He just was constantly writing songs. He had the albums that he would release, and he showed me his sort of private vault of like 1,000 songs, I thought. And I just looked at him, and he was depressed, actually, when I visited him. I didn't realize it in the moment, but I sort of retrospectively was like, that guy was depressed. It took him like an hour to answer the door. He didn't put a seatbelt on when we went to get breakfast burritos. His wife had just left. He was missing he was feeling terrible. And I said to him, how do you do it? How do you write all these amazing songs? Like, what's the secret? And he said, I just set the bar as low as possible. I thought, that was so smart. It's like the smartest piece of advice I'd ever heard, and so counterintuitive. Set the bar low. Figure out what will get you to the keyboard. That could be writing for a shorter period of time. It could be just free writing without giving yourself the assignment, stepping away from the thing that is heavier for you to write, or is your ego's more wound up in it. But that's fundamentally kind of how it works, for me anyway. There's always a moment of surrendering, of giving up. And sometimes that's giving up on the idea of writing a novel, for instance, and saying, well, I'm going to write something that feels to me a little easier because I've been thinking about it and working through it, and because I can rely on certain skills as a journalist, a nonfiction writer, that are a little stronger right now in me. I'm not a novelist naturally. I'm too distracted and whatever, maybe too frightened. Whatever it is, it's not my calling. And, or working on short stories. Whatever it is that I feel like I can feel good about what I'm doing, or at least not feel bad about it. And another example of that is some years later, when I was still wrestling, I'd written 2 more failed novels. And a friend of mine said to me, I don't think you really want to write a novel. I think you want to be a novelist. You want the credit you don't actually want to do that kind of work. And I was so furious at him, which is, again, like with the agent, the evidence that somebody has your number is that you're pissed at them. Like, God damn you for being right. But it was helpful in the sense that I said, I think he might be right, even though he's an asshole for saying so bluntly. And I said, maybe I went through a lot of anxiety working on the 5th book and almost feeling like it might get published and then getting blocked and waking up at 4 in the morning with this dread churning. And I thought, doesn't feel good or right or natural. And so I just said, I think I need to give up on this. I need to say, what if I never wrote a novel? Certainly nobody in the world was waiting for Steve Almond to write a novel. You're all very kind for being here this morning, but none of that thought has never passed through your mind. You're like, oh, why isn't Steve Almond writing a novel? That was my hang-up. That was my ego need. And it was predicated on things that I now understand a little bit better. But it wasn't me being genuinely curious about the world, like when I stepped into that candy factory. And the world and my curiosity took over, and my ego could sort of take a back seat. And so I did. I gave up 3 or 4 years ago. I just said, okay, I'm never going to write a novel. It's okay. I'll write other things. I like writing other things. There's lots of ways to tell stories. And somehow the act of just taking that pressure off of myself opened up this creative space inside of me. And I started working on what I thought of as just a story. And it was a story about a young woman, Honduran American. Her family's undocumented. She's growing up in the Northern California of my youth in 1981. It's the Reagan Revolution. Reagan's just been elected. She's in Sacramento. And she's tremendously courageous and really smart, but she's born into a story where her options are very limited and her margin for error is very small, like Jane Eyre and all the Dickens orphans and Harry Potter. And she's been told her whole life to remain invisible, as many people are, just for safety's sake, because her family's undocumented. She has to just be invisible. And so she's there in 8th grade in Sacramento, hiding in the back, even though she's the smartest person in the class. And her 8th grade teacher knows this and spots her and makes her visible, and pairs her for the science fair with the most popular girl in class. And because it's 1981 and there's no text messages or Google Docs, she has to go over to Jenny Stallworth's house. And once she walks into the Stallworth's house, she becomes visible to Marcus Stallworth, the dad, and Rosemary Stallworth, the mom, who have immediately powerful and unwholesome ideas about her. It is actually dangerous to become visible in the world. And Lorena, of course, is thrilled by all this attention. Her mom's always working, her dad's nowhere in sight. So she's incredibly excited to become visible in the world and to be seen for her tremendous intelligence and her courage and even her desirability and so forth. And so attached to her great desire and passion is danger. And that's a hell of an engine for a novel. But I wasn't calling it a novel. It was just a story I was writing. And the muse that is not actually inside of us, it's outside of us, walked Lorena into my imagination. And then I just became ravenously curious about how things were going to go for her. And something called the chain of consequence. It's what Aristotle calls, the chain of consequence. Not this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. That doesn't create any tension. But this happened, and therefore this next thing happened, and because of that, this third thing happened. And you're kind of building this ramp. As Lorena becomes more visible, she's placed in more and more danger. And soon her family's pulled into it, and the FBI, the police, Nancy Reagan eventually. It was like a rocket ship. It just took off. And I think that was because I didn't even think of it as a novel. It was completely unattached to the ego thing that I was bringing, all the pressure that I was bringing to the keyboard for decades. I just thought of it as the Lorena story. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger until it was this sort of shape and size of a novel. And that was really instructive. Just to be able to say, actually, sometimes it's necessary to give up, or to give up on the idea of a certain thing and just say, I need to get away from that habit of thought. It's not serving my storytelling. It's getting me jammed up. And those are the two. I also have become much more forgiving of periods where I'm just struggling to get to the keyboard. Because writer's block is with you always. We think of it as a condition, a binary. You have it or you don't, but it's not that. It's actually the way in which those two forces are in tension. That self-belief that gets you to the keyboard and gets you to believe that you have something to say to yourself and to other people, a story that you want to tell. And that voice that says, oh, you're not worth it, it's not worth it, it's all going to end badly. Quit deluding yourself. Those feelings are always in tension with one another. And when I get stuck, it's like a little moment of writer's block. Any of you had the pattern of rewriting the same paragraph over and over again? All the time. And that's what I think of as a block. You're blocked at the level of story. You don't know what the next beat is. So what you do is you start to obsess about the paragraph. And if it's just perfect, then you'll solve that story problem. It's okay. That's a form of block. And sometimes we'll write a story and create or introduce a whole bunch of different possible plots. That happens too, and I think that's, your hands are busy, but in some ways you're blocked on allowing yourself to really tell the story that's the most important to you. Probably because it's psychically disruptive. That's another way of getting blocked a little bit. So rather than thinking about writer's block as a condition, we should just think about it as the condition. That you're always going to have moments of creative struggle and stasis, and that you are not, I mean that they're intermittent, and that any kind of creative state is temporary. When it was flowing and I was writing Lorena and I was more interested in the story than whether I was telling that story well, and I was just chasing it rather than pushing, that was beautiful. It was glorious, and it didn't last. It lasted for a while, and it got me through that book and the revisions of that book, and it got that book into the world. But it didn't make it. It's not as if I didn't get blocked while I was writing the book. And even in particular moments, like for me, the internet is a distraction that's so powerful and seductive that it's like the handmaiden to writer's block. It says, well, you're kind of feeling stuck or confused or maybe some doubt. Don't worry, there's a cat video to watch. That's research, exactly. I got to do some research, yeah. And, I even think, I just think everything that human beings pay attention to is meaningful. You can go and look at a cat video. There's a great cat video. I write about it in Truth is the Arrow. And it's the cat video where the cat is trying to leap onto the roof. He's on a fence. He's sort of perched on a fence, and he's aiming for the roof. And the roof is about, I don't know, it's maybe about 5 yards away or 4 yards or whatever. And some helpful internet person has put a bunch of mathematical formulas and bubble thoughts over the cat's head. Do you guys know this video? Yeah? And then, the cat's doing all the math. And suddenly the cat leaps, and you're like, the cat's going to do it. And the cat leaps and just plummets. Comes nowhere near the roof. That, to me, is the story of writer's block. The belief that you can sort of will your way there. But the cat does actually finally get to the roof. And it's not because the cat does little cat crunches, or figures out the math. It's because the cat accepts that failure is inevitable in creative endeavors and learns from it. Says, you know what, I need to find a part of the fence that's closer to the roof. Or maybe this is beyond my measure and I need to find a leap that's more attainable for me. Right? That's the story of the cat video, if you see what I mean. I'm just not a believer in people beating themselves up. I understand it, I do it all the time, but it doesn't actually help me get done the things that I want to get done. So, all right, that's all I have to say in terms of prepared remarks, but I hope you guys will have questions, and I'm happy to try to answer them or talk with you about them. Yeah, Arati.
So about the learning from failure and getting to accept it and face it head on. I'm someone who has such a paralyzing fear of failure. So what are some things that I can do to prepare myself to be like, okay, failure is something that I will face, and this is something I can do to accept it and learn from it instead of being so petrified of it.
Yeah. Well, the first step, so the question is really about how do I stop being so petrified of failure? And I mean, obviously, like that's above my pay grade. But it's helpful that you are identifying that that feeling is unbearable to you. And to think about why it might be unbearable and what are the voices that you weren't born saying, wah, wah, failure's unbearable, you know? Like you were born into a particular story and there are voices in your history that were making failure feel unbearable. And some of that stuff gets absorbed and internalized and then it becomes your story and you have to kind of undo it to the extent that you can. Not on a straight trajectory with some internal resistance. I think, so I don't have a great solution other than identifying that you're going to have to, or here's what I would say, it would be healthiest if, whenever I hear myself saying I should or I have to or you have to, even worse, the proper way to say it is it would be a lot kinder to yourself. It would be a lot healthier if you would allow yourself the room to not be perfect all the time. And to actually say, my job isn't to be perfect, that doesn't even feel healthy. That feels very clenched and as if you have no margin for error. Now, sometimes those voices are coming from an understandable place. If you're a woman of color in a world that is dominated by white supremacy and misogyny and patriarchy, then there's a lot of reason that you might justifiably feel that when you succeed, you better be perfect. And so that's stuff that is around you. And if you see what I mean, it's, to my way of thinking, it creates a real paradox, which is it's important for your voice and story to be heard since it's been underrepresented, but there's greater pressure on you to remain silent. And one of the tricks that patriarchy and white supremacy and other forms of kind of internalized hatred can play is to say, I have to do it perfectly or it's worthless. To apply the same standard that you might have for the SATs to something like telling a story, which feels completely nuts to me, but I'm a white guy who was born on third. So it's easy for me to say. Do you see what I mean? And I'm really saying that to anybody who's in any kind of marginalized group. There are these larger cultural voices that are telling you you have to be perfect, or giving you reasons to not speak up. And that's a kind of self-collusion that you have to clock as well. But even outside of that, there's whatever was happening in your family culture and in the community that you grew up in that was probably sending lots of messages about how you had to do it perfectly. And you're not going to get over that overnight because it wasn't internalized overnight. It's going to be something that's going to be with you. And you just have to be aware of it and step back from your situation and say, okay, part of my work here is to accept that there is no guarantee of success in this kind of endeavor. It's just not how it works. There is a way to get a 1600 on the SAT and a perfect score on the LSAT and a quarterly report that is flawless. I think creation is inherently more fragile than that. And it requires a different standard of self-forgiveness and self-acceptance. If you see what I mean. Yeah.
So, the particular brand of writer's block that I struggle with, that I'm hoping you have some advice on, is you know what you want to write about, you plot it, you have all the plans, and you get there, and it's all the words are just gone. Do you have any advice on that?
Well, so there's two kinds of writers, broadly speaking. Or not, that's wrong. It's not that there's two kinds of writers. There's two ways that people go about writing that I have identified. And sometimes they have the term pantser and a plotter. And sometimes it's a forager and a gardener, right? You're a gardener. You're a plotter. You want to have your scenes outlined, and you want to have your schematic. You want to know what you're writing towards. Your executive function is taking the lead. And when you arrive at the story, it doesn't feel alive. It sounds to me like there's no space for, in a way, intuition, wandering, not knowing, being lost. Freedom of association is the way Vivian Gornick talks about it. And in fact, I think successful writing, in the same way that you're trying to balance the self-belief, the irrational self-belief with the like self-hatred stuff, you're trying to balance the part of yourself that is intuitive and associative and flowing and bring that under the mediation of your executive function, right? Because it's great to say, just let it rip. And there's lots of first drafts where I've let it rip. And it's actually quite confusing, indulgent, whatever. I got lost. I followed an association. I got distracted. I got a bit of ego need. I started flogging the language. And the result is a story that is not successful. It's not worthy yet of the reader's attention. So you need to be able to balance those two things. And if I was advising somebody like you, I would say, okay, I get it. You've got, you feel the need for that ballast to organize things out. That's good. Do that. That's fine. Now, do some free writes. Do some free writes. Do some writing that is not at all structured and that is purely relying on your ability to loosen up and be at play and improvise without a sense of where it's going. Because what I'm hearing really is an anxiety about control. And part of what you have to, and like your friend is like, yeah, nailed it. Right? Okay. But you're now in an arrangement where you can't control it. You can't control whether you succeed or fail. And you need to like loosen up the bolts a little bit. And that's the reason that I do generative workshops. Because when when I just say, write for 20 minutes about a childhood obsession, people really allow themselves to go there. Because there's nothing at stake. They haven't organized the whole novel. And now you arrive with all this pressure to like start delivering deliverables. You've got a schedule. You've got a production schedule all set out for yourself. I think you're out of balance would be my like amateur diagnosis. And you need to try some free writing and some writing that's much more in the world of that chain of associations. I put on top of every draft I write, SFD, shitty first draft, to remind myself that the job of that first draft is exploration. It's literally your job to not know and to explore both consciously and unconsciously what you're interested in and what's the nature of the character's desires and what danger is cleaved to that desire. Sometimes it's very obvious, like in the case of Lorena, and sometimes it's very remote. And sometimes you have to play tricks on yourself. So for instance, years ago, one of the stories that wound up in that first collection, one of the non-pornographic stories, was a story, it was based on something that just happened when I was traveling to see a friend of mine who just had his first kid, a daughter, and his mom had just died. And I went to see him up in Maine. And I wanted to congratulate him and also, offer condolences because he was very close to his mother. His mother's sort of the center of the family and very warm person. And I arrived and I walked in and my friend Tom greeted me and his dad was there, the widower, was in the kitchen. And I could see through the house, through the doorway, in front of the fire was the mom with the little baby on her lap, and she was eating a tangerine, the mom, not the baby. And it was like this beautiful little tableau, and I was like, yeah, that's where it is. That's where the life is in this room. But I had to get through the kitchen, and the dad sort of cornered me. And it seemed to me, and he started asking me about my life, and I said, oh, well, I'm an adjunct professor down in Boston. He said, oh, he told me this long story about when he was an adjunct professor, and he had to go one night, he started telling me this crazy story, he had to go and identify the dead body of one of his students so they could notify the next of kin. It was this very dark story, and of course, he's just lost his wife, so death is on his mind, and this is a time where he was separated from his wife because they were in different places, so I understand why the memory was coming back to him. And he's telling me this long, beautiful story, and I'm sitting there awkwardly listening, wanting to say, I gotta get out of here, man. This guy's, why is he cornering me, man? He's got a granddaughter to love on. And it stayed with me, you know, I through the visit, that's all I remember of the visit. And I went home and I kind of wrote a version of the story, because at that time, that's what was my job, just to write short stories. I didn't have to worry about money. All I had to do was, you know, buy cheap chocolate. And I wrote that story, I disguised it, I made him, he was a poet in real life, I made him an anthropologist, and you know, a bunch of stuff got sucked out of my subconscious, memories and associations, but that was the basic story. And then that story got published in this first book of mine, and I'm taking the long way, but I think it'll connect. When that book came out, my dad sent me a really lovely note, a letter. And he said, you know, your mother and I have read your book, and we do carry it in a brown paper sack, and some of the other relatives won't talk with us anymore, but, I see what you're up to, and I really, you know, I admire you for going for it. I just want to say about this one story, it's called Among the Eek. He said, I wanted to say about Among the Eek, I just wanted to tell you that I didn't realize how distant I had been as a father. And I reared back from that letter and said, oh my God, Dad, what are you talking about? That story wasn't about. Of course it was about him. Of course it was about that feeling of the mom being the emotional glue, and once the mom's gone, the dad doesn't, he's kind of in orbit. And that's why that stayed with me. And what I'm getting at is that my job was just to pay attention to my attention. To trust that if my mind snags on something, it's meaningful, even and especially when I don't know the meaning of it. Even when I finish the whole story and it still isn't clear to me what it's about. And my dad has to tell me, this is what you were writing about. Because if you had said, well, sit down, Almond, and write a story about your distant father, I would never have done it. I would have been too worried about him and maybe about me. So that first draft is exploratory. You don't know. All you know is what you're interested in and what you're curious about. And that's your job, is to chase it. And that story came reeling out of me because it was an ancient story that I was finding in the present. But there's lots of times, many other kinds of stories where I am just lost. And sometimes those stories work out in the end, and sometimes they don't. And all of it is your job as a writer. Not just when it's working and it's successful, but to get through the times where you are struggling and you're a little bit lost and you haven't figured it out. And you fall into the distraction of whether you're doing it well and the reader will like you and whether you'll ever be published and all that stuff. I understand all of those feelings. They're just not very helpful to my work. So I keep trying to find ways to turn the dials down. I can't get rid of the dials. Those were installed. But just to turn those dials down, or just even to take note of when those dials are, what's that sound? It sounds rather ominous. Oh, okay, thank you. How long does this session go? Just till 12, is that it? Oh, is it over now? Wow. Okay, well, I'll take one more question. I have my little books if people want to do drug deals, yeah. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, okay, so what if you find that you get blocked because you start doubting your own bias? Like, I feel like everything I've written has a misogynistic tone to it that I have 11 brother-in-laws. And so I kind of am biased towards their biases, I think. Uh-huh. And I write against that, which they probably do have some worth. You know, it's like.
Wait a second, I got a little bit lost.
Okay.
I was with you with the 11 brother-in-laws, and that you write in a way that you think is misogynistic.
Right. I mean, women like what I write because I make fun of men.
So that's not misogynistic, that's the other way.
Well, no, I think I write that they are misogynists.
Yeah.
basically.
That, okay. I mean,
And so, but I'm thinking that perhaps that I should address myself, that perhaps, I remember my mother telling me several times growing up, because I had no brothers, she would say, remember, boys have feelings.
oh,
And
Wow.
I think that that's a problem.
here's what I'm hearing. That you are probably on to, like all you guys are identifying, here's what I think I'm struggling. I think you are fearful that you're flattening out these male characters into caricatures. Yeah. And what I would say is, okay, but that's not going to get you, truth is the arrow and mercy is the bow.
Right.
You know, you're going to have to figure out you're going to have to figure out what causes them to behave in those ways, because it certainly isn't that they feel so good about themselves.
Oh, no.
Hold on. That's your bias showing itself.
I know.
It's not that they're evil. It's that they're in pain and they are putting that pain into the world. And I think you're very wise to say, I know that I'm playing to the balconies here and that women will enjoy hearing me trash my brother-in-laws, but that there's probably a deeper story.
They're good people.
Right. So your job is then to write about the parts of them that are tender and kind, or maybe wounded in ways that you can see and maybe they can't even see. Right. But good on you for identifying that, because you could happily stay within your biases. And the really interesting question is, why do you keep telling that story, and why do you need to tell it in a way that is so familiar? And your mom is a really good teacher here to say, hey, boys have feelings. They express them differently. They're more likely to, pull your hair than say, I like you.
They trip you.
Right. But here's, right, okay. And so no wonder you're still writing about them, because you were the recipient of some of their shit. Right. And what I would say is, so then in a way, part of what you're hiding from is writing about your own experience and your own pain. And it's easier to sort of say, look at this, look at these bad actors than to say, oh, that was painful for me. The most interesting thing you're trying to get to in any story is self-revelation, where a character has to run up against an inconvenient truth, whether that's a brother-in-law or you, writing about the brother-in-law. When you know the story and how it ends, it's quite flat. It just doesn't have any space to be round. And most things are both ways at once. It's really not but, it's almost always and. Right? So your brothers-in-law are misogynists, and they're also kind and big-hearted and in pain and ... Yeah. Maybe one more question? Yeah.
This is going back to something you said early in the talk. You have to love a character from the inside. You have to know a character from the inside.
It would be
You have to-
healthiest if.
You have to love them.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you have to love them? I mean, could you just be intrigued by them or confused by their behaviors or?
Yeah, let me broaden out what I mean by love. I don't mean that you approve of them. I don't even mean that you admire them. I mean that you regard them and that you pay attention to them. And that attention, if it's compassionately applied, implies mercy, or at least some form of understanding. I think love's a big, squishy word. We all mean very different things by it. I mean that I think sustained attention is an act of love. I think it's actually what we mean when we say love. So, and I think what I'm getting at is that when you write about a character, it's a great example, these brothers-in-laws, there's 11 of them. When you're writing about them and you are pointing out how, sexist their values are, their behaviors or whatever, you're kind of safe because you're putting them in the ironic mode. That means you're looking down on them and you're asking the reader to also look down on them, right? And it's safe because you're above them and they're below you. And anybody who's part of a marginalized group knows that that's basically a description of patriarchy or white supremacy. That anybody who isn't right, a different gender or different ethnicity or race or whatever, it's just, you're looking down on them. That's the natural order of things. And for me, when I say love, what I mean is that you, even if, and especially if that person is damaged, you still somehow feel for them. You identify, you feel implicated by their struggle. Even old Nancy Reagan, right? My job was to figure out what I have in common with Nancy Reagan, not to just flatten her out as I've been doing for decades. And that's what I mean by that you should love the character, that you should recognize something of your own struggles and wounds and blind spots in them. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, young, and rich, is got a lot to recommend her. And she's also, like a lot of entitled people, she's damaging because she meddles in people's lives and causes appreciable harm. And the novel, Emma, tells us on the first page that this is going to be a story about a person like Emma running up against the limits of their entitlement and being made aware of the damage that they can do. And the reason that we enjoy that is because we're all engaged in that struggle. There you are in your entitled way, writing about your poor brothers-in-law, right? There's a certain kind of entitlement in that. I entitle myself to tell the story and, seek revenge on them for their bad conduct and so forth. We recognize, in other words, Emma Woodhouse, not because of her virtues, just the opposite, because of her flaws. The broken parts of herself that we recognize in ourselves. That's why we feel less alone when we read a great book, because we go, oh, okay, good. Everybody else is equally fucked up. That's what I mean by love. Everybody else is equally fucked up. Okay. I'll end there on that profane note. But I'll hang around. I have my little DIY books. And when's the next session? I think I'm doing a session this afternoon. At 1? Okay, right on. Okay, yeah. Okay. Thank you, guys.